Welcome to part 12 of this YSL tutorial series on basic programming in Visual C#. In this part of the series we're going to cover how to use arrays, and we'll begin the video by showing you how to declare a simple array and then how to set its dimensions. We'll also talk about how to initialize and populate an array, and talk about 3 different methods for looping through an array, including using while loops, for loops, and Foreach loops. We'll talk about a couple of useful techniques you can apply to your arrays, including how to sort and reverse them, and also how to find values in an array. Later on we'll talk about how to work with multi-dimensional arrays as well, and talk about how much more complex they are to work with than a basic single-dimension array. Right at the end of the video, we're going to mention a technique that allows you to resize an array, and also explain why that's a bad idea and why you should try to avoid it if you possibly can. So there's quite a lot to get through. Let's get started. To get started in this video, you'll need a copy of the project we worked on in the last part of the series. If you don't already have a copy of that project, you can use the link in the description below the video to download one. And once you've downloaded it, head into Visual Studio, head to the File menu and choose to open your project. You can do that in one of 2 different ways. You can choose Open Project and then browse to the location you've downloaded it to, or if you've worked on it recently, like I have, you can use the Recent Projects and Solutions list and simply click on the link for the project you want to open up. So once you've done that, it should open up your WODA or your YSL's dating agency solution, and this is the starting point for our video on arrays. To demonstrate how arrays work, we're going to create a new form in our application that displays a list of the most popular dates in the dating agency. So to do that, we're going to create a new form in the project. So let's right click somewhere on our project in the Solution Explorer and choose to add a new Windows form. I'm going to call my form WODA Hot Dates, and then click the Add button or press Enter to create that. I'm only going to add a single control to the form to begin with, and that's going to be a list box, which will display our list of dates. So if we head to the toolbox and find the list box control, we can drag one of those onto our form, pop it somewhere up towards the top left hand corner, maybe resize it a little bit as well. And then we want to change the name of the list box so it's got a sensible name, so we can use the properties window to do that. So we find the name property. I'm going to call this Hot Dates List. What I'd then like to do is create a way for the user to see this form, and I'm going to do that by having the user click a button on the application form. So I'm going to open up the WODA application form by double clicking on it, and then I'm going to use the toolbox to draw a button on the form, so I can drag one of those into maybe the bottom left hand corner, and I'll change the text on the button so it says something like see hottest dates, and then we can change the name of the button as well so that it says something like hottest, or in fact hot dates button. To add some code to the click event of that button, the simplest thing to do is just double click on the button to generate the event handler for that button's click event. So if I double click on the button, it will open the code file behind the form and generate the click event handler for that button. A couple of simple lines of code. We need to declare a variable that can hold a reference to a WODA hot dates. So I'm going to say WODA hot dates, and I'm going to call this hot dates form, and we're going to make this equal to a new instance of WODA hot dates. All we then need to do is display that on screen, and we can do that by applying the show method to the hot dates form. So we can say hot dates form.show, and that will be sufficient to make that form appear on screen. We've also got to make sure that the WODA application form is the one that's displayed on screen when we first run the application. If you've copied this project from the last video, then the last form we had loading up automatically was the Foreach loops form. So if we head back into the program file by double clicking on it, we should see that when we start the application, when the main method runs, it runs a new instance of the Foreach loops form. So we simply need to replace this now with a reference to the WODA application form instead. And then we save that and just give the system a quick test. If we click the start button, we should see that our WODA application form appears, and if we click see hottest dates, it will make our hot dates form appear. So that's all set up, ready to go. What we can now start doing is concentrating on how to write code to work with arrays. So what we're going to do in our WODA hot dates form is have a load event for the form, which creates an array, fills it with a list of values, and then uses that list of values to populate our list box. It's a bit of a roundabout way to go about doing things. You wouldn't ordinarily do this in the real world, but it's a neat way to demonstrate how arrays work. So to get to the load event behind the form, you can either just double click in the background of the form, or select the form and use the properties window on the events tab to find the load event there and double click load there instead. So either way of doing that will generate the event handler for the load event for that form. Rather than writing all of our code directly within the load event handler, what we're going to do is write several separate methods which we can then call into the load event handler later on. This will let us demonstrate the various different aspects of arrays a little bit more conveniently. So the first technique we need to learn about with arrays is how to declare them and how to populate them. So let's create a private void method somewhere within our class, which we're going to call declare and populate array. And in there we can write some basic code that does exactly that. Now declaring an array is a lot like declaring a simple variable. The main difference between an array and a standard variable is that an array can contain multiple values. So if we declared a string variable, it could hold a single string. If we declare a string array, it can hold multiple individual strings. So let's declare a string array. So we start with the data type again, or the object type, whatever type of thing you're storing in the array. We're going to store a list of strings. And then to make sure that this is an array rather than a variable, we simply open and close a set of square brackets after the type name. We can then create a name for the array, just like you create a name for the variable. So we're going to call this, let's call it hot dates. And then type a semicolon at the end, and that's a simple declaration for a basic array. Before we can start populating the array, we need to tell the array how many compartments or how many elements it should have. So we can do this in one of two separate ways. We can either write out a separate instruction altogether to declare the number of elements, or we could combine the number of elements in the declaration of the array itself. To show how it works as a separate instruction, what we would do is we'd say hot dates equals a new string, and in a set of square brackets we then state the number of compartments or the number of elements we want the array to have. So we finish that with a semicolon, and that will generate an array with 4 individual compartments. It lets us hold 4 separate individual strings. Rather than doing that as a separate instruction, what we could also do, if we comment out that line altogether, is we could combine that in the declaration of the array itself. So we could say string hot dates equals new string, open some square brackets, and declare the number of elements we want it to have there. So it's entirely up to you which way around you do this. There's no difference in the end result. For this particular demonstration, I think I'm going to go with the second example there, where we declare the number of elements for the array in the declaration of the array itself. It's probably also worthwhile quickly mentioning that you can set the number of elements for an array using a variable. So rather than using an explicit hard-coded constant number that like we have here, the number 4, we could actually have a variable which calculates some value and then uses that value to set the number of elements of the array. So it's a very quick demonstration. You'd have some kind of integer variable, which I'm going to call elements, and we could make that equal to any number, any integer. So I'm going to make it equal to 4. And then what we could do when we declare our array is we could say, rather than hard-coding the number 4 there, we could refer to the value in our elements variable. So that's another way to set the number of elements your variable should have. For this demonstration though, I'm going to go back to the original version where we have the number of elements hard-coded in the declaration of the variable itself. Now that we've set the dimensions of the array, we can start populating the individual elements of it. So to do that, you start by writing out the name of the array, which is hot dates, and then in a set of square brackets, you write out the number of the element that you want to populate. Now we've stated that our array contains 4 separate elements, but all arrays in C# are based from 0. So the first element isn't element number 1, the first element is element number 0. So our array goes from element 0 through to element number 3. So we're going to say hot dates 0, and then we're going to make that equal to a simple string of text. So let's think of somebody who would be a popular date. Let's have Natalie Portman as the first person, and then that process just continues. For each other element that you want to populate, you write out the name of the array, and then in a set of square brackets, the number of the element, and then another person. Let's have a boy this time. Let's have Ryan Gosling. I think he'll probably be quite popular. Then we'll have hot dates 2, and that can be somebody else. Let's have I don't know, Katy Perry. And then we can have hot dates 3. Let's have another boy. Let's have I know, oops, wrong key there, just hit the page down key, apologies. This will be, I don't know, Brad Pitt, always a good choice, I guess. So Brad Pitt, there we go. So there's populating the individual elements of an array one by one. Rather than writing out separate instructions to populate the elements of an array, you can actually initialize the values of an array in its declaration. So what we're going to do to demonstrate that is have another method. Let's create another method down below the first one, which we're going to call private void declare and initialize array. And in here, we're going to declare the same array as previously. So in fact, I'm just going to copy that for the time being. I'm not going to copy this semicolon at the end though. What I'm going to do is copy the declaration of the array and the fact that it has 4 elements. And then I'm going to open up a set of curly brackets or braces. In there we can actually populate the individual elements of the array just by writing a comma separated list of the strings we want to use. So just to make life a little bit easier on myself, I'm going to copy and paste some stuff from the previous routine, and we're going to just tweak things a little bit. So we're going to take away all the references to the individual elements and instead replace those with a simple comma separated list. So you can do this all on a single line or across multiple lines, of course. You can lay out your code in C# pretty much the way you want. But that is a way to declare and initialize an array. If we add a semicolon right at the end of that set of curly braces, then that will declare the array and populate the 4 elements in the order we specify them. So this Natalie Portman will be element number 0, Ryan Gosling will be element 1, and so on. It's just a slightly cleaner, clearer way to populate the array rather than writing out several separate instructions to do so. Okay, so now that we have the array populated in one of 2 different ways, we can use that array to populate add the list box on our form. Let's create a separate method to do that altogether again. So let's have another method which we'll call private void, we'll declare as a private void, and call it populate list box. And we're going to do this quite a slow, long-winded way. What we're going to do is refer to each individual element of the array and read the value out one by one. So we need to contain in this method again, we need to store or have the same code that generates the array and populates it. So I'm just going to copy that from the previous routine. And then what we're going to do is say hot dates list, which is the reference to the list box on the form, dot items, which is the property which refers to the number of items or the items in the list box, and we want to perform the add method or apply the add method to the items collection. We're going to add a new item into the list box. The item we're going to add is one of the elements from our array. So we're going to refer to the hot dates array, and then in a set of square brackets we'll put in element number 0, so that will put Natalie Portman's name in the list box. The simplest thing to do at that point is to copy and paste that line 3 times, and then just simply update the numbers, so we refer to element 1 and 2 and 3. And at that point we can actually call this populate list box method in the main load method for the form. So we scroll back up to find the load event handler for the hot dates form. We can simply call our populate list box method, and then that will populate the list box when we launch the form. So to test that this works, let's start the application by clicking the start button, and that should display our Woda application form. And then we can click the See Hottest Dates button and see that we get our list of items or the elements from the array listed out into our list box. So not particularly sophisticated, and we could have done this completely without using arrays at all. We could have just directly populated the list box. But it's a neat little demonstration of how to declare and populate a simple array. So let's close down that form and close down the Welcome to Woda form as well, and then just close down the output window. As ever with writing code that you're encountering for the first time, using breakpoints and stepping through your code can be a really useful way to see what's going on in the background. So I'm going to set a breakpoint on the populate list box method. I'm just going to do that on the signature line of the method, and then what we can do is start running the application again by clicking the start button. And then when we click the hottest dates button, we'll see that we pause on the first line of the populate list box method. So we can see again in the locals window, and if you can't see the locals window, head to the debug menu and choose Windows and choose locals, so that will appear. You can see that the array to begin with contains nothing, so it's set to null because it's an array of strings. As we continue pressing the F11 key on the keyboard to declare and initialize the array, we'll see that now the array has got 4 individual values in it. If you want to see what those values are, you can simply expand the hot dates array by clicking the little triangle next to it, and you'll see the individually numbered elements and the values that each one contains. So that means, of course, that if we continue using F11 to step through, that each of these items will be added into the list box before the form gets displayed. So I'm just going to stop debugging at that point by clicking the stop button or shift and F5, and then remove the breakpoint and close down the output window. So you can always remember you can use breakpoints in stepping through your code to really see what's going on behind the scenes. Now, although referring to each individual element in the array is fairly straightforward, it's not a particularly convenient or quick way to do it, particularly if we had more elements. If we had 40 or 400 elements rather than just 4, that's going to get very, very tedious. So another convenient way to process an array is to loop over all of the elements in it. And we can do that using one of 3 different types of loops, as we've seen in the previous 3 videos. We've got while loops, for loops, and Foreach loops. So let's start with a quick look at a while loop. If we create another method, which I'm going to call declare as a private void, and we'll be let's call this while loop, and then in the braces, what we're going to do is declare our array again, so we can just copy and paste that from the previous routine, and we can then declare an integer variable as well. So we're going to say int I and initialize that to a value of 0. And then what we're going to do is use a while loop to loop over the array. To begin a while loop, of course, we write the word while, and then in a set of parentheses, we write out the condition that determines whether the loop should continue processing. So what we're going to do to make this work is we're going to use our I integer variable to keep track of the number of elements we've processed. So essentially we're going to say while I is less than the number of elements in the array. So we can do that by referring to a property of our array. We can say hotdates.length. So length is a property that returns the number of elements in every dimension of the array that we've created. We haven't dealt with multi-dimensional arrays yet in the video. We will do that towards the end. So currently our array contains a single dimension which has 4 elements in it. So the length property of our array will return the number 4. So as long as our I variable is less than 4, what we would like to do is 2 things. We'd like to say hotdateslist.items.add, and then in a set of parentheses refer to the particular element of our array. So I'm going to say hotdates, open square brackets, I. So the first time we pass through the loop, I will be equal to 0. So it means that it refers to the first element of the array, which will put Natalie Portman's name into the list box. Then the next time we go around the loop, we want to make sure that I has increased. So I'm going to say I++ to increment the counter, and that will make sure that the next time we go around the loop, it will be equal to 1, and then 2, and then 3. And then the next time round, I will become equal to 4, which is not less than the length of our array, because the length of the array is 4 as well. So at that point, the loop will stop processing. So what we can do now is we can plug in this while loop method into our main load method. So let's take away the populate list box method and replace that with our while loop method instead. If we give this routine a quick test then, if we hit the start button to start debugging our application and click see hottest dates, we'll see exactly the same list, but a lot more conveniently done. So rather than writing out a reference to each individual element in the array, we can simply loop over it using the while loop. Just before we move on to the next type of loop, it's worthwhile quickly mentioning another way to test if we've reached the end of our array. So previously here we've used the length property to determine the total number of all of the elements in every dimension of the array. Now, as I mentioned, we're only using a single dimension array at this point. Our single dimension contains 4 elements, so the length property contains or returns the number 4. Now, in a multi-dimension array, let's imagine we had an array that had 4 elements in its first dimension and 2 elements in its second dimension. We'd have an array that contains a total of 8 elements. So what would happen at that point is we'd have a while loop that continues running 8 times rather than just 4. We're going to explain multi-dimensional arrays towards the end of this video, so that will become a little bit more clear. But what I'm trying to demonstrate here is sometimes it can be quite important to find the number of elements in a single dimension rather than the total number of elements in the entire array. So if you wanted to do that, you wouldn't use the length property of the array. What we could do instead is use a getUpperBound method. So the getUpperBound method allows you to specify a particular dimension of an array, and that will tell you the highest element, or the number of the highest element in that dimension of the array. Phew, this will become a lot more clear later on in the video, if it's not particularly clear right now. So, getUpperBound, if you open a set of round brackets, and then the array's dimensions are indexed from 0 as well. So the first dimension, we only have a single dimension in our array, is numbered as number 0. So this particular property for this particular array will return the number 3. So get upper bound of the first dimension of the array will return the number 3 because that's the number of the highest element in it, 0, 1, 2, 3. So a quick little tweak of our condition, if we say while I is less than or equal to the number 3, continue processing will essentially result in exactly the same result. If I click the start button to start debugging and then click the see hottest dates button, we'll see exactly the same list in our list box. This is important for later on, as I say, with multi-dimensional arrays. So for now, just bear it in mind. This is a more accurate way to return the number of elements in a specific dimension rather than the total number of elements in all of the dimensions of your array. Okay, so the next type of loop we can use to process our array is a for loop, which again we've covered in a previous video in the series. So just a very quick overview of how this will work for an array. We'll create another method, private void for loop. And in here, we're going to create another copy of the same array. So let's copy and paste that from the previous routine. And then we're going to create a for loop. So we can do that by writing the word for, and then open a set of parentheses. And then there are 3 things we have to specify. So we need to essentially declare and initialize a variable that's going to keep track of the number of times we process the loop. So I'm going to say int I equals 0. Then a semicolon, where we write out the condition we want to evaluate. So I want to check that I is less than or equal to hotdates.getUpperBound, open round brackets 0. So tell me the number of elements or the number of the highest element in the first dimension of the array. And then another semicolon at the end of that. And then we say what we want to do to our control variable, our I integer variable, each time we process the loop. So again, we're going to say I++. So obviously, the advantage of using a for loop over a while loop is that all the individual elements that make the loop process are contained in one single statement. So rather than as in the while loop, you declare the variable separately, you write out the condition separately, and you write out the change to the control variable separately. With a for loop, everything's done in one single instruction. So what we can do then is essentially exactly the same thing. We can say hotdatesList.items.add, open some round brackets, refer to our hotdates variable, and in some square brackets pass in the value of I. So once again, this will result in exactly the same end result as our previous routines. This is just a slightly more convenient way to do it than using the while loop. So once again, if we go back to the main method, the load event for our form, we'll replace the while loop with a for loop or a call to the for loops. Wherever I put it, the for loops method, for loop method, there it is. And then if we start the application, we can see, once again, when we click the see hottest dates button, we get exactly the same list as we have previously. Let's close all that down, close down the output window. There's an example of a for loop to process an array. The final type of loop you can use to process an array, and probably the most convenient and simplest to write, is a Foreach loop. So again, let's create another method that will allow us to demonstrate this. Let's have a private void Foreach loop. And then in this method, we're going to create another copy of exactly the same array. So let's copy that from the previous routine again. And we can write a Foreach loop that will process this array. So let's start with the word Foreach, and then open some parentheses. And in here, what we need to do is declare a variable which can hold a single one of the values in one element of the array. So because we're processing an array containing strings, we need to declare a string variable. We can call this whatever we like, so you might call it something simple like S. I think I might call mine something a bit more descriptive. I'm going to call it hot date. Then we say in, and then the name of the variable, which is hot dates. So for each individual string in the array of strings contained in the hot dates array, we want to do something with them. So instead of braces, all we're going to do is add an item to our hot dates list box on the form again. So we can say hot dates list dot items dot add, open some parentheses, and then all we need to say here is hot date. that's the name of the variable which controls or holds a single one of the strings in the entire array. So the advantages of using a for each loop is you don't have to worry about calculating what's the top end of the array. You don't have to worry about comparing whether you've reached the end of the array or not, and you don't need to worry about what item you're specifying, what index number of the item is you're specifying. So there's no reason to count the items. The for each loop will simply identify the total number of elements in the array, and for each individual one of those will process it naturally, and when it reaches the end of the array it ends automatically as well. So it's much more convenient. The only thing you lose is the ability to refer to the index number of the element of the array. So unless you desperately need that, a for each loop is probably the best way to go. So once again, let's plug that into the main load method up at the top. We can replace our for loop with a call to our for each loop method instead. Say for each loop, open and close some parentheses, semicolon at the end, and what we can then do is start the application again. Click on our see hotkey states button and see we end up with, once again, exactly the same list. So you've seen three different ways to process a loop. Process an array, sorry. You can use a while loop, you can use a for loop, or a for each loop. If you're working with a single dimension array which contains basic data types such as strings or integers or other types of numbers, it's fairly easy to sort the items in your array into ascending or descending order. So what we can do for our list of names is, let's say we want to see them listed alphabetically rather than just in the order we've populated the array. We can do this for any of the three loop types we've used. So we can use it for the for each loop or the for loop or the while loop. Because we're already hooked up with the for each loop example in our load method, I'm going to add a quick sort to our array just before we process the array itself with the for each loop. So in that method, what we're going to do is use the array class and use the sort method of that class. So we're going to say array.sort, then open a set of parentheses, and all we have to do is pass in the name of the array that we want to sort. So I want to sort hot dates. So with a string array, that will sort in alphanumeric order. If it was an array that contained integers or doubles or things like that, it would sort in ascending order of the number. So what we can do then is, if we just run the application again, we'll see when we click the see hotkey states button that the names will come out in a different order. They'll be sorted alphabetically. If you wanted to reverse alphabetically sort, then you have to do something a little bit different. What we have to do to begin with is, of course, actually sort the array in ascending order, as we've done here already. To get the array to be reversed then, there's another method of the array class called reverse. So what we can do is, immediately after we've sorted it, we can say array.reverse, and then in parentheses again pass in the name of the array that we want to reverse. So we can say hot dates, and then that will sort them in reverse alphabetical order or descending order for a number. So if I start the application again by clicking the start button and then click the see hotkey states button, we'll see the names come out in reverse alphabetical order this time. So it's just a quick simple thing you can do to change the order of the items in the array. Having shown you a variety of ways to loop over an array, it's worthwhile mentioning that if all you are trying to do is populate a list box using the value stored in the array, you don't actually have to loop over the array at all. We can actually do this in a much more simple way. I'm going to demonstrate this with another quick simple method. So let's create another private void which we'll call populate list box quickly. And then in this method we're going to copy and paste the declaration of our array again from the previous method. So let's copy and paste our hot dates array one more time. And then to use this array to populate a list box, all we actually have to do is change a single property of the list box itself. So if we refer to hot dates list and look for its data source property, we can modify this so that it's equal to the array called hot dates. And that genuinely is all you actually need to do. So it isn't necessary to loop over the array at all. I was just looping over an array is a useful thing to be able to do, but for this particular example, this would be by far and away the quickest way to do it. If we just return to the main load event method for this form, and we'll call our populate listbox quickly method here instead. So rather than calling our for each loop, we'll say populate listbox quickly, and then let's run the application or start the application. And when the form appears, we can click see hotkey states, and we'll see once again the list box gets populated, but in a much faster way than looping over the individual items in the array. As I say, looping over an array is a useful skill to have or to learn anyway. We'll see that used in more later videos in this series. One other useful thing you can do with a single dimension array is attempt to find a value stored within it. So let's declare another method that allows us to demonstrate that. Let's have another private void, I'm going to call mine find item in array. And then in this method, once again, we're going to copy and paste the array that we declared in the previous method. So our hot dates array is going to get copied and pasted one more time. What I'd like to do then is I'd like to try to find one of the names in the list. Let's say Ryan Gosling, and we're going to return the position that Ryan Gosling occupies in our current array. So to do that, we're going to need to declare an integer variable which can hold the result, and I'm going to call mine where is Ryan. Then we're going to set that to be equal to a method of the array class. So we refer to the array class, and we're going to use the index of method. So the index of method returns the index position of an item that you're looking for. There are two parameters to fill in for the index of method. The first is the array that we're looking in, so in this case it's going to be hot dates. And the second parameter requires the value you're searching for. So for us, we're searching for Ryan Gosling. Okay, so having done that, let's display a simple message box on screen that tells us where Ryan is. So we'll have a message box and .show, and I'm going to say Ryan is in position, and then we'll concatenate the value stored in the where is Ryan variable. I'm going to apply the toString method to explicitly convert that into a string, although technically you don't have to do that in C#, but I always like to do that explicitly. And then last of all, we'll just make sure that the list box gets populated so we can see that Ryan actually is in the position that we're reporting. So we'll say hot dates list dot data source equals hot dates. So I'll just do it the quick, simple way for now. Okay, so once we've written that out, we can then go back to our load method for the form, and we can replace the call to the populate list box quickly method with a call to our find item in array method instead. And then if we start the application, we can click on the see hottest dates button. It tells us Ryan is in position number 1, and that's because of course the array is based from 0, so Natalie Portman is position number 0, Ryan Gosling in position number 1, and so on. So, a quick simple way to find an item in an array using the index of method. It's worth quickly mentioning that if you change the order of the items in the array, of course the index of method can return different answers for the same value that you're searching for. So for instance, after we've reported the original position that Ryan Gosling occupies, we could sort the array. So we could, after we display the message box, say array.sort, and then pass in the hot dates array to tell it which array to sort. And then we could try to report on Ryan's position again. Let's do that quickly and simply by cheating, basically. So if we copy these two lines except for the int data type, then we can reset the value of our where is Ryan variable and show another message box saying what his new position is. We could also do an array.reverse after that as well, just to demonstrate once again that it will change. So we can say array.reverse, then open some parentheses and say hot dates once more. And then again, we can just paste in those two lines that we've just copied. So we'll report on Ryan's position 3 separate times through the scope of this method now. So if we start our application, we should see now that when we click on our see hottest dates button, we'll see 3 message boxes in a row. So Ryan is in position number 1 to begin with. That's his original position in the list. When we sort the array, Ryan drops to position number 3. So he'll be the last item in the list, 0, 1, 2, 3. Then if we reverse the array, then Ryan will become the first item in the list, so it becomes position number 0. When we finally see the list, of course, we'll see the finally sorted array of items, so Ryan Gosling sitting right up there at the top in position number 0. Let's close down all the forms and let's get rid of the output window there as well. Finding the position that an item occupies in an array can be useful if you want to actually modify that value. So rather than just reporting where Ryan actually is, let's remove all of these lines which show the message boxes, and we'll just stick with the first instance where we refer to the index of method. So when we find out where Ryan sits in the array, we can then use that number to replace the value of Ryan Gosling. So we can say, for instance, we could say hot dates, open square brackets, where is Ryan, close square brackets, and we can make that equal to a different person. Let's say, I don't know, Hugh Jackman instead. So let's say that Ryan Gosling gets replaced in popularity by Hugh. So having done that, what we can do now is run the application again by clicking the start button, and we can click our see hottest dates button, and this time we'll see that where Ryan Gosling previously was in position number 1, he's been replaced with Hugh Jackman instead. Now, of course, this technique only works as long as we're searching for something that definitely exists in the array. If we try to search for somebody who didn't exist, like Ryan Gosling, for instance, that would fail. So the index of method would return a value that is 1 less than the index of the lowest bound item in the array. So the lowest bound item has an index of 0, so the index of method here will return the value of -1. And that means that in this line we try to change the value of element -1 in our array, and because that doesn't exist, that line will fail. So what we could do is add an if statement to make sure that it's only going to happen as long as we've found a valid item. So just before we try to modify the value of that item in the array, we could have an if statement which checks if where is Ryan is greater than or equal to, and then we're going to refer to the hot dates array. And as we did earlier on, we got the upper bound element of the array. We can also get the lower bound element of the array using the getLowerBound method. So we say getLowerBound, and then in a set of parentheses we say which dimension we're looking in. So again, we're in a single dimension array, so we use the element 0, or the number 0, to refer to the first dimension, the only dimension in this particular array. And as long as that condition is met, then we can update the item at that position, just in the same way we did previously. So in this particular example, if we search for somebody who doesn't exist and we start the application, we should find that Ryan Gosling doesn't get replaced, so Hugh Jackman doesn't appear. If I close down that and close down the application as well, and then update this so we search for Ryan Gosling again, so making sure we search for the correct person, and if we start the application again, click see hottest dates, this time Ryan Gosling does get replaced because it returns a valid index. So just one thing to watch out for if you're going to use the index of method with your arrays. So far we've only dealt with single dimension arrays, so let's have a quick look at how a multi-dimension array works as well. Let's declare another method. We'll call this private void, and we'll call this multi-dimension array basics. If I could type as quickly as I could talk, if only. So multi-dimension array basics. To get started, we'll save a bit of time by copying and pasting a whole bunch of code from a previous method. It's probably the first one that we created in this entire class. So it's the one that created our very, very basic array, where we individually set the values of each individual element. So let's just copy all of the code from there, and then paste all that in to our new method as well. So, to declare a multi-dimension array, we start by adding a comma into the square brackets next to the data type. So if I add a comma there, that declares an array with 2 dimensions. If I added a third comma, that would a second comma, that would declare an array with 3 dimensions, and so on and so on and so on. There's actually no limit in C# to the number of dimensions your array can have. To keep things incredibly simple, we're going to stick with a simple 2-dimensional array. So in the first dimension, it's going to have 4 elements. We've already declared this here, like so. In the second dimension, it's going to have 2 elements. So you can almost think of this as like a basic table, or like an Excel spreadsheet if you like. It's going to have 4 rows and 2 columns. So to indicate that, we're going to say string with a comma in there, and then in the initialization of the array, we're going to say string 4, 2. So that declares an array with 4 elements in its first dimension and 2 elements in its second. Now at this point you'll probably notice that of course we still have some errors where we're trying to populate the array with values, and this is of course because we haven't specified which precise element in each of the dimensions we want to populate. So when you have a multi-dimension array, when you populate it, you always have to say which elements you're populating. So to populate the first row in the first column, if you want to think of it that way, we'd have to say 0, 0, and that would be sufficient to clear that particular error. So for Ryan Gosling, that'd be 1, 0, and then 2, 0 for the next, and 3, 0 for the next. What we'd also want to do is specify, let's say we want to specify what gender each person is. So in the second element of the second dimension, we could do something like this. Probably easiest just to copy and paste one line for the moment. And immediately after we set the name for a person, what we can then do is set the second element of the second dimension to be the person's gender. So that'll be girl for Natalie Portman. And then for Ryan Gosling, if we paste that line in again, we can say 1, 1, and that'll be boy. And then we'll copy and paste the girl line for Katy Perry and say 2, 1, and then one last time we'll paste it in for Brad Pitt and change that to 3,1, and that'll be a boy as well, of course. So populating the array, it's up to you. If you want to put the spaces in to make everything consistent, it's entirely up to you. I can't resist doing things like that to make things nice and neat. But that's how you populate arrays with more than one dimension. You have to specify which element in each dimension you're passing a value into. The same is true when you want to read values from a multi-dimension array. You have to refer to which element of which dimension you're getting a value from. So if we wanted to begin populating our hotdates list box, we can say hotdateslist.items.add, and then let's make a combination of the name and gender of the person. So we'll say, first of all, we'll say hotdates, open square brackets, 0, 0. And then we'll concatenate that with, let's say, a string with a space and a dash and a space, and then another plus, and we'll concatenate that with hotdates, square brackets, 0, 1. What I'm then going to do is copy and paste that line 3 times, and then we can simply update the numbers so they go 1, 2, 3 for the first dimension, and likewise 1, 2, 3 for the first dimension in the second reference. So, having done all of that, if we then update our load method by referring to our multi-dimension array basics method, so let's replace find item in array with multi-dimension array basics, and then start the application again. We ought to see that this time, when we click the See Hottest Dates button, we get a list of people and their names and genders. So that's the basics of referring to items in a multi-dimension array. Just as we saw with our single-dimension arrays earlier on, it was possible to avoid having to individually set the value for each element by initializing the array, so you incorporate the setting of values in the array in the declaration itself. And we can do something similar with a multi-dimension array, although the syntax is ever so slightly different. So let's start by declaring another method to demonstrate this. I'm going to call it private void, and let's call it initialize multi-dimension array. I'm starting to wish I picked shorter names for my methods at this point. Multi-dimension array. What we'll do in there is we'll declare our same array, so in fact let's just cheat and copy and paste that from the previous Resizing. And as part of the declaration, what we're going to do is set the values for each individual element. So to do that, let's get rid of the semicolon at the end of the declaration, and instead we can open and close a set of braces. What we then need to do is pass in pairs of values to each individual element of the array. So in order to do that, we actually need to open and close another set of braces. And the first person was going to be Natalie Portman. So the first actual value we'll pass in will be Natalie Portman. And then after that, we have a comma, and then pass in the gender. So Natalie Portman is a girl, of course. So we have a comma separated list of each value that gets passed into the array. What we then need to do is have another comma to separate this from the next pair of values. So in another set of braces, we then have the next person, which in our case was Ryan Gosling. So let's just cheat a little bit here to avoid having to type things in. Copy and paste, and then Ryan Gosling, of course, is a boy. And then another comma, and then we'll have another set of braces, and the next person will be Katy Perry, who, of course, is a girl. And then another comma, and then one last pair of values, which will be Brad Pitt, which I'll just type in quickly, it's a fairly short name, and also boy. Dear me, boy, there we go. So right at the very end of all of that, we have a semicolon, and that's how to initialize a multi-dimension array. We can loop over the items in a multi-dimension array in exactly the same way we did for the single-dimension array. We can either use a while loop, a for loop, or a Foreach loop. We saw earlier on that the Foreach loop was the shortest, simplest syntax. So let's have a quick little demonstration of how that works with a multi-dimension array. Let's have another method. We'll say private void. We'll say multi-dimension array Foreach loop. And then in here, we're going to copy and paste the declaration and the initialization of that multi-dimension array from the previous method. And then immediately after that, we're going to have a for each loop, which loops over all of the elements of that array. So we'll say for each. And then the elements of the array are of a type string. I'm going to call them S this time, just for short. And we're going to say in hot dates. So just like as we did before. What I'd then like to do is add an item to my list box for each individual string that I encounter in that array. So I'm going to say hotdateslist.items.add, just as we've done previously. And then in a set of parentheses, we're going to specify that we pass in the value of s, semicolon at the end, and that's the simplest, shortest way to do that. So let's head back to the load method for the form, and then we'll call our multi-dimension array for each loop in there. So let's get rid of that call, and we'll call this multi-dimension array for each loop. If we start the application now, and then click on our Show Hottest Dates button, we'll see one tiny little problem with the way this for each loop works. Each individual item in the array gets separated onto its own individual line. That's not quite what we wanted to do. A for each loop isn't necessarily the best way to loop over a multi-dimension array, because each item is treated completely individually. So what we'll do instead, if we close down the forms and close down the output window, is we'll show how to do this using a for loop instead, which is probably somewhat of a better choice when you've got a multi-dimension array. So let's create another method that lets us demonstrate this. We'll have another private void, and this will be a multi-dimension array for loop. Should have just copied the previous one, shouldn't I, really? Multi-dimension array for loop, and then in there, the first thing we'll do is copy and paste the definition of the array from the previous method once again. We can then begin our for loop by saying for, and then open some parentheses and declare our integer variable int I equals 0. And then, just as we did last time, we used the get upper bound method, didn't we? We said while I was less than or equal to the hotdates.getUpperBound method, and we specified which dimension we were interested in. So we specified dimension 0, which is in this case the dimension with 4 elements in it. Another way you can do this as well, by the way, rather than using just getUpperBound, you can also use the getLength method. So we saw the length property earlier on. The length property returns the number of all of the elements in the array. So in this multi-dimension array, we've got 4 elements in the first dimension, 2 elements in the second, so the total length would be 8. So the length property would return the number 8 in this particular example. We could also use, rather than the length property, we can use the getLength method. What the getLength method allows you to do is specify exactly which dimension you're interested in. So I could say getLength 0, and that would tell me that there are 4 elements. So this would return 4. If I said getLength 1, that would return 2, because there are 2 elements in the second dimension. So we can use this, or we can use the getUpperBound. I'm going to use the getLength method. I'm going to say, well, I is less than the result of getLength. And then, of course, we need to make sure that we increment I each time we iterate through the loop. So we say I++. Then, in the set of curly braces, all we need to do is populate the individual elements in the individual items in our list box. So we're going to say hotdateslist.items.add, open some parentheses, and again we're going to do this concatenation. We're going to say hotdates, open square brackets, I, 0. So that will refer to the person's name for whichever row we're in, effectively, if we're thinking of this still as a table. So we're in row number 0, or row number 1 if you like. So that will return the name of the first person, plus this basic string, plus hotdates, open square brackets, I, 1. So this will return the gender of the person, boy or girl. So with all of that done, let's just plug this into our main load method, so multi-dimension array for loop. So we can replace this multi-dimension array for each loop with multi-dimension array for loop instead, and then start the application. And this time when we click See Hottest Dates, we'll see that each person and gender occupies a single line rather than being separated out into multiple different lines. So that's the advantage with a multi-dimension array. A for loop has definite advantages over a for each loop, and you're probably going to want to consider using for loops rather than for each loops for your multi-dimension arrays. Now in this last example, where the second dimension of our array contained only 2 elements, it was fairly easy to refer explicitly to element 0 and element 1 in the second dimension. But if we had lots more elements, that's going to get more and more awkward to do things like that. So let's have another example where we have more than just 2 elements in the second dimension. Let's create another method. We'll call this private void multi-dimension array nested for loop. And we'll see exactly why we're calling it that in just a moment. So to get started, let's just copy and paste everything from the previous method into this one. Then we're going to extend the number of elements in the second dimension. I'm going to update this to 3, and that means that we'll need to pass in a third value for each individual set that we pass into the array when we initialize it. So as well as having the person's name and their gender, let's also have their status. So I'm not sure whether these are true or not, so please don't take this as read. I'm going to say Natalie Portman's single, and I'm going to say Ryan Gosling is also single, and then I'm going to say that Katy Perry is dating, and then Brad Pitt I'm going to say is married. I'm not sure why he's joined a dating agency in that respect, but anyway. So we've got 3 elements for the second dimension now. We could, of course, just start referring to the third element in the second dimension by using the an explicit number again, just as we have here. But what we're going to do instead is write a nested loop that loops over the elements of the second dimension as we're looping over the elements in the first dimension. To do that, just inside the braces within our for loop, we can begin another for loop where we're going to say for int j equals 0, and now we're going to say while j is less than hotdates dot get length, but this time we're going to pass in a reference to the second dimension by putting in the number 1. And we'll carry on doing that and incrementing the j variable each pass through the loop. What we can then do is open a set of curly braces again, and then this will allow us to process not just the elements in the first dimension but also the elements in the second. What we can then do is build up a string that will finally add into our hotdates list box. So I'm going to declare this string variable just above the for int I loop. So we'll say string s, and I'm not going to bother initializing that because each time I iterate through the first loop, the outer loop, I'm going to say that s is equal to string.empty. So we'll clear out the contents essentially of that variable each time we encounter a new row in the array. What we can then do in the inner loop is we can make s equal to itself plus the next item for the next element in the second dimension. So we're going to say s plus equals, and then we can refer to hotdates, open some square brackets, and then I, comma, j, plus this little string, this explicit string, the space and the dash in the space to separate out each individual value. Close a semicolon there, and then on this last line what we can finally do is, rather than add explicit references to the individual elements of the second dimension, we can simply now say add an item that is equal to s. So having done all that, let's just have a quick look at what this does. If we call this multi-dimension array nested for loop from our main load method on the form, multi-dimension array nested for loop, there it is, and then we start the application, what we should see now, when we click the see hotted states button, is we'll get a list where each row in the list box consists of 3 individual items from the array. Now one tiny slightly rubbish thing about this is that we get the space and the dash in the space after the last element in the second dimension as well. So let's just tidy up a little bit and get rid of that. We'll close down the forms first of all and get rid of the output window, and then we can see about tidying that last little part up. Now we've got a couple of different choices for the way we could do this. We could, for instance, just wait until we finish processing the inner loop and then just strip off the last 3 characters from the end of the final string. We know they're always going to be there. So we could just rely on that fact and use some of the basic text functions. So we could say something like s equals s.substring. So substring is a method of a string that allows you to return a smaller string from within it. There's 2 parameters to provide. We can specify the starting position. So the individual characters in a string have a 0-based index, much like the elements in an array. So we say we're going to start at 0, and the number of characters that we want to return from that position is going to be equal to the length of the entire string minus 3, because there are 3 individual characters that we don't want right at the very end. So to return that, we can say s.length. So length is a property of a string. which returns the total number of characters in it, and we want to subtract 3 from the result to get rid of those last 3 characters. So that's one way to do it. It will certainly work. If we start the application again and we click the See Hottest Dates button, we'll see that we get rid of those last 3 characters right at the end. I'm going to close that down, and then there's one other solution we can look at as well. So to demonstrate this next approach, let's just comment out the line we've just written here by adding a couple of forward slashes to the start of the line. And then we know that we only want to add this little string as long as we're not on the last element of the second dimension. So what we can do is we can use the conditional operator to test for that. We've covered this in a previous video, albeit very briefly. So what we're going to do is remove that little section of code there, and we're going to concatenate the result of this conditional operator. So we're going to say the condition is going to be while j is less than hotdates dot get upper bound, and we're interested in the second dimension here, so we're going to enter the number 1. So while that condition is true, what we want to do is add on the space and the dash and the space. When the condition is not true, all we want to do is add on an empty string. So having done all that, if we start the application one more time and then click the See Hottest Dates button, we once again get exactly the same result as though we just stripped off the last 3 characters. We just made sure that in this case those 3 characters only get added while the j variable is less than the highest element. So we don't add the dash to the end of the last element. So it's very much personal preference, this, I think. Which one do you prefer is your choice. In all of the examples we've done so far, we've declared the exact dimensions of the array we want to create and then populated them either by initializing them or assigning values to each individual element. But what if you wanted an array whose size might change? So maybe we could declare an array with some elements in it to begin with, but then we want to either add items to it or remove items from it later on. If you get to the stage of asking this sort of question to do with arrays, then really the question you should be asking is an array the right tool for this particular job? Arrays aren't really designed to be dynamic and flexible in terms of the number of items they hold. You shouldn't be allowed to sort of add items to or remove items from an array. If you're doing things like that, then you should consider a different structure, something like a list, which we're going to cover in probably the next video in the series, in fact. It is technically possible to resize arrays, so I just want to quickly finish the video off with a quick look at how you can do that, but bear in mind the recommendation is that you shouldn't be doing things like this with arrays. If you find that you need to change the sizes of arrays, then really you should be considering using something like a list or another collection type. So just to get started with this, what we're going to do is declare an array at the level of this form class. And we're going to revert back to our single dimension array. So in fact what we can do again is probably just cheat. If we go back to the declare and initialize array routine, what I'm going to do is copy that array declaration from there, and then I'm going to scroll up to the top of the class, and just within the class I'm going to paste in that definition or that declaration. So that now means we have a hot dates array whose scope is the entire class, which means I can refer to it within any method in this class. So I'm then going to find my load event handler method, and I'm going to get rid of any reference to any other method that I've written. And instead we're going to write a really simple routine that populates our list box with a simple Foreach loop. So I'm going to write a Foreach loop, so I'm going to say Foreach, of course, string s in hot dates. Now obviously I haven't declared hot dates within this method, but because it's declared within the class I can still reference it. And then all I'm going to do is say hotdateslist.items.add, and then open some parentheses and say s. So whenever we launch the form, that will populate the list box in the same way we have done previously, just relying now on an array who's scoped to the entire class. The next thing we're going to do is add a button to the form that we can click on, and that will change the size of the array and add more elements to it. So if we go back to the design view of our World Hot Dates form and find the toolbox, we're going to find the button tool and draw a button on the form, and then we'll change the text on the button, let's say. So we can change the button text so it says add items. So we'll add a few items to the array, and we'll change the name of the button so that it says something like resize array button. We can then just double click on the button to generate the event handler for the click event of that button, and then a bit of code that we're going to write in here that's going to resize the array, and let's say that it's going to add 2 or 3 more elements to our hot dates array. Next, I'm going to declare a couple of variables just to make life a little bit easier. So I'm going to say int current size, first of all. So this is going to hold the current size of the array. So I'm going to use the length property of the hot dates array. So I'm going to say int current size equals hot dates dot length. We've used the length property a couple of times already. So that returns the number 4 with our current array with 4 elements in it. I'm also going to declare a variable that says how many extra elements I want to add. So I'm going to call this extra elements. Sounds like a good name. I'm going to make this equal to, say, 3. What I then want to do is apply the resize method to the array class. So I'm going to refer to the array class and then refer to the resize method. And in that method we need to pass in 2 things. We need to pass in a reference to the array that we want to resize and then a number that determines the new size of the array. Now, the resize method is a little bit of a misleading name actually, because it doesn't technically resize the existing array. What happens is it creates a brand new array altogether with the new size that we specify. Then it copies all of the elements from the existing array into the new array and then almost just forgets about the original array altogether. That didn't exist. But the new one has the same name as the old one. So the end result is that it looks as though you've just resized the original array, but technically that's not quite what happens. When we pass in a reference to the array, I don't know if you can see this as well in the little tooltip down here, it's telling us that we need to pass in this particular argument as a ref type rather than as what we usually use, which is a value type. Now we're going to get into more detail about the difference between ref and value types in later videos in the series, but essentially when you pass in a value type it's almost like passing in just a copy of the information. So if you make any changes to the piece of information in the method itself, it doesn't reflect back in the original calling method. If you pass in a ref type rather than a value type, you're passing in a reference to where this information is stored in memory. So any changes made to the item in the method that you call is reflected back in the method which called it. That will make a lot more sense in later videos in the series. We'll go into that in a bit more detail. But just for now, you need to bear in mind, you must, if you want to use the resize method, you must pass in your array as a ref type rather than as a value type. So you do that by specifying ref and then the name of the array. So this is going to be hot dates, then a comma, and then the new size that we want to specify is going to be equal to the current size plus the extra elements. So I can say current size plus extra elements. So essentially that will recreate the array with 3 more elements than it had originally. Now that we've created those new elements, we can begin populating them in the same way we would ordinarily. So we can say hot dates, open square brackets, and then refer to the element number, or the index number of the element. So previously we had elements 0, 1, 2 and 3. We've now got 4, 5 and 6 as well. So if I knew explicitly that I had 4, 5 and 6, I could pass those in, but I might not know what the original size of the array was. So what I can do instead is I can rely on the fact that I stored the current size of the array before I resized it. So what I can do is refer to the current size, which is, if we remember, return the number 4 when we have 4 elements in the array. So I can refer to element number 4 by saying hot dates current size equals, and then let's think of a new person to add. Let's have Ryan Reynolds. I believe he's quite popular. And then we can have another line that says hot dates, and then we can say current size plus 1. And then make that equal to, let's say, I know Keira Knightley. I can't think of anybody else. And then one more we need to populate. Let's say hot dates current size plus 2, and make that equal to, let's think, Emily Blunt. Let's have. Let's spell her name properly first. There we go. So that will populate the new 3 elements that we created in the array. All the other things you can do to the array now are just the same as we've seen previously. So we can sort the array, we can say array.sort, and we can pass in hot dates and get that sorted alphabetically. And then let's say we want to clear out the existing list box. So we'll say hot dates list dot items dot clear. So that will remove everything from the list box. And then we can repopulate it just by saying hot dates list dot data source equals hot dates. Okay, so having done all of that, let's have a quick test of the whole thing. We don't need to change anything in the load method, because the load method, all that does now is as soon as the form loads, it will populate the list box with the original values of our array. So if we start the application and then click on our See hottest dates button. So we see that we get the original list of 4 people. Then if we click the Add Items button, we'll see that we get an extra 3 people. We've changed the sort order there as well. So the code works. The end result is what we wanted. But an array isn't really the thing you should use to do stuff like this with. The resizing operation is quite expensive in in performance terms, so you should avoid trying to do this if you can possibly do so. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseR website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.